Hi, my name is Celine Truong, and today I'll be investigating the impact of climate change on carbon soil sequestration and plant pathogens with the help of my mentor. So for the table of contents, I'll be talking a little bit about just climate change in general, and what I will be doing in this presentation and talking about. And then I'll be going over my introduction and how climate change impacts like generally and also impacts the grasslands and forests. And then I'll be talking about my methods of how I got my information. And then I'll be going on to talk about the impacts of climate change on plant pathogens and also what is carbon soil sequestration, and then my overall final thoughts. Okay, so going on to the background. So we have heard a lot about just like prominent like climate change events that happened this year, such as like the Canada's wildfires and more recently the Maui's forest fires or like wildfires in general, which shows how prevalent climate change is to learning about and to just reducing in general. So this is an effect of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that increases the rate of global warming due to human activity. And although we've learned a lot about like different ways that we can store carbon, and like the ocean being one of the biggest carbon sinks, the soil is also an important carbon sink that can sequester atmospheric CO2 due to its soil microorganisms. So as stated before, I will be discussing the impacts of climate change on the carbon soil sequestration and its interaction with plant pathogens. And I will also provide some valuable insights on how we can utilize the soil to reduce some of the effects of climate change. So, I have talked about wildfires being a consequence of climate change in general, but there's also a lot of different long-term effects, such as severe droughts, water scarcity, melting glaciers, intense storms, declining biodiversity, and the rising sea levels. And as you heard in a few previous presentations, climate change does not only affect our environment, but it affects both mental and physical health, which is really important as why we should combat climate change. So, importance and effects on forest and grassland areas. So, grasslands comprises of 26% of our total land area and 80% of productive land use for agriculture, and they can also alleviate greenhouse gas emissions, and they are also a really big important part of being feed for our grazing livestock. And now, due to climate change, which has extreme precipitation and increasing periods of droughts and fires, this creates change in soil moisture and also increases both above and below ground plant growth and the microbial community compositions and functions of the soil. As for forests, they make up a third of our land area and contribute towards our global balance and protection by increasing the water drainage and combat soil erosion. And in 2022, the US forest stored 59.7 billion metric tons of carbon, which is a significant amount of carbon. And due to climate change, there are the potential of these forests being from carbon sinks into carbon sources in the future due to the increasing temperatures, the forest fires, and drought severity. And even though there was a lot of different responses in the different forest ecosystems, all bacterial and fungal communities have shown to respond to climate change. So talking about the IPCC future scenarios, these range from a list of 5 possible scenarios that could occur in the future. And these were measured through calculations of human activity and the amount of carbon emissions that were calculated. So these range from an optimistic scenario all the way to an avoid of all cost scenario. And although they couldn't really figure out, like, cannot say like which one was most likely in our future. It's important as it shows how human activity does have an effect either way. Like the most optimistic scenario still has our temperatures like rising. So it was just something to consider about. And so going over our methods, or going over my methods, I basically started with a general overview of how or what was soil sequestration and the climate change using research papers and journal articles. And then I analyzed the relationship and impacts of climate change on carbon soil sequestration and also plant pathogens. And then I also researched possible ways that we can increase the resilience of soil against the effects of climate change to provide solution to combat climate change. So going on to my discussion. So what is carbon soil sequestration? So this is basically a way of storing carbon into the soil through the assimilation of CO2 via soil microbes. And so there are two main ways of taking this carbon and implementing it into the soil system. There is above ground plant litter, and there's also below ground. So for above the soil, there is photosynthesis, which the plants capture CO2 and translocate that CO2 into the roots. And then there's also the food chain, in which these plants could be consumed by animals. And there's also the adding of soil on top of plants, which allows for the decomposition of these plants to be added into the soil. So now that the CO2 is translocated below the ground by the plant soil, it allows the carbon to be sequestered and deposited into becoming dead microbial biomass. And so now that the CO2 is down into the soil, it can go deeper into the rhizosphere via the plant roots, which is the rhizosphere is the soil zone composed of many microbes, and where plants will take water and nutrients up their roots through this area, and then microorganisms can interact with the roots exfoliates. And the rhizosphere is kind of named as like the microbial powerhouse because it just holds so many microorganisms there. So the roots exfoliates are a substance that comes from the secretion of living plant roots, and they consist of simple molecules such as like sugar, amino acids, sugar alcohols, organic acids, and complementary secondary metabolites. And then there are another process called the rhizodeposition, which releases organic compounds from plant roots into the surrounding soil. And all of these different processes make up the base of the soil organic carbon that is in the soil. And then we also have the extracellular polymeric substances, which is also known as EPS, which basically plugs soil pores. And what this does is this allows the retention of water in the soil, which is significant because it allows for the soil aggregate cycle to occur, and where the microorganisms will attach themselves to soil particles by the EPS, and then when the microorganism dies, the soil aggregate cycles happens, and this allows for soil carbon to occur. So here is a diagram of the process, just so like you guys can have a visual of what's happening. So we start off with atmospheric CO2, in which is photosynthesized and photosynthecated to translocate into the roots. And this happens with the root excavation to the rhizosphere. And then we have the metabolism of small and macromolecules in the rhizosphere and beyond. And then this all goes respiration of the soil organic molecules, and then the process repeats itself. So how does climate impacts the sequestration of carbon? So it's shown that warming temperatures and altered precipitations can create abiotic stresses for microorganisms, but there is a limited information regarding of how climate change actually affects these soil microorganisms. I found a study by Zhang and more other agronomists that evaluated the effects of warming and altered precipitation on soil microorganisms and how these affected the soil microorganisms and the soil. And the results was that it could cause taxonomic shifts, which is basically just like defining and characterizing organisms in the soil bacterial community. And both factors together alter the bacterial community. However, just one factor by itself was not significant enough to make a big difference. However, for this, there's not that much research on it, so more research going on to how climate impacts soil sequestration is also needed. So climate change effects on plant pathogens. So climate change has been shown to change the areas and where crops will be produced, as well as the vector of the plant populations causing disease, and where crops were also predicted to decrease globally by 2050 due to plant pathogens and pest distributions going towards the poles, which due to like warming temperatures, which shows how like the distribution of diseases are spreading globally, just not like towards like the tropical climates. And so as CO2 concentration increases, the photosynthetic rate and crop yield of C3 plants are expected to rise. However, this is not a good thing overall, as disease severity is also expected to increase in rice and wheat, which are two of the biggest staple crops for our society, as well as C4 plants not benefiting anything from higher CO2 concentrations due to their inherent CO2 utilization mechanisms. And there was also shown to be changes in regional distributions as well, as new pathogen strands may become better at adapting to increasing temperatures, and also the influence of the disease incidence and the severity are also expected to change, as well as an example of pathogen inocula has been showing to display a higher prevalence outside of the tropic areas. Okay, so a general overview is that most plant diseases favor rainy conditions, high air humidity, and high soil moistures. The pathogen infections increases at higher temperatures as air can hold more water vapor, increasing the possibility for dew accumulation to occur. However, in contrast, soil moisture is more critical than air humidity when it comes to soil inhabiting pathogens, in which many of them causes like plants to wilt, just depends on the crop and all. So for example, there is the Streptomyces spp, which is a plant like pathogen. They favor lower soil moisture for disease development. So you're probably wondering like, oh, one way to combat this is just to increase the soil moisture, right? However, this this pathogen is an exception to a lot of the other plant pathogens out there, because this one favors low humidity rather than high humidity. And these differences in how plant pathogens are is just really tough to find like a balance between what we can do to like combat the climate change and reduce the amount of plant diseases that occur. But overall, the environmental conditions seem to have prevalent effects on pathogen infections, and it could change the way like the pathogen structures are, and also like how plant pathogens multiply and stuff. Though this area of study probably needs like more studying, because a lot of the research here is limited in a way. So after we learned about what is soil carbon sequestration and climate change effects on both plant pathogens and on the sequestration, I wanted to kind of introduce some ways that we can further like add implications on how to combat and reduce the effects of climate change. And one way to do this is to increase the soil resilience. And there are a few ways that we can do this. So first up, going over just planting more plants. This allows the plants to cover up the soil, making sure that the soil loses no nutrition, also increasing the plant diversity by adding like organic material into the soil and things like that, encourages microbes and biological activities, and not only keeps the soil healthy, but also increases soil biodiversity as well as plant diversity. And then we have microbial biofilms, which are basically a community of aggregated microbial cells that are embedded into like a self-produced matrix, and by acting like a protective clothing, they are able to protect the microorganisms from ultraviolet rays, extreme pH, high salinity, and high pressure. So on top of that, they help recycle nutrition. They also provide high tolerance to environmental stressors and allows for the engagement of beneficial microorganisms and also the prevention of harmful microorganisms. So overall, I had a really fun experience kind of researching all of this. I would like to give a big thanks to my mentor, Angela. She was so helpful and so sweet through all of it. And I also want to thank her for introducing me to this topic. I have an interest in biology, and I also really like learning about like diseases, like not only for like humans, but I also wanted to like look further into like plants because I just think like plants are just really cool. And she allowed me to kind of like mix in like the plant pathogens with this topic. And I think that was just a really cool experience. I also would like to thank the Talaria staff for being really helpful. And overall, just learning about what other people research as well was really interesting. A lot of like coding stuff, and AI stuff, which is really cool to learn about. So overall, thank you for listening, and thank you to Laria for giving me this opportunity.